Hello Master and welcome back. So in this video we're going to keep exploring how your caregiver's behavior towards you may not have had anything to do with you. Because again, the ultimate place that we're going with this is to understand that any part of ourselves that has been rejected, abandoned, shamed, guilted, any amount of you have to be this way that you aren't, any amount of there is something fundamentally wrong with who and what you are, is disconnected from true reality. And that it is based on a consensus reality that is a projection, that is a misunderstanding, that is a lack of resource, that is a lack of capacity, that is holding up a structure that works for some at the expense of the many, but it's never actually true that there is a fundamentally broken, bad, wrong part of yourself. And we start with looking at all the ways in which we were trained to reject, abandon, shame, deny any part of ourselves in our childhood from our caregiver's perspective. We start with that because that was where we got those first programs, that there is something fundamentally wrong with me, right? And all in the process of awakening to reality course, we're slowly chipping away at that resistance to loving these parts of ourselves that our caregivers abandoned and rejected in us. Because that resistance is there as a self-protective mechanism, always. Because again, in our childhoods, we had to live up to what our caregivers expected us to be in order to feel safe and like we were going to get our needs met. So that first primary fundamental program, that there can be bad parts of self that are existential threats to us, is a really, 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 really hard program to overcome. It's a really hard program to say, that wasn't true reality. My caregivers weren't speaking true reality to me. My caregivers were speaking from their own limited perspectives and perceptions of what reality was in order to try to get me to line up with all sorts of different messy things that may have nothing to do with real, true reality and who I truly am as a being. Because again, the fundamental reality is, and this may be something we need to work up to, but the fundamental real reality is there can be no fundamentally flawed part of you. There is no fundamentally flawed part of you. And then the second truth is, wherever you are struggling, wherever you are causing harm to yourself or others, every time, with no exception, there is nothing wrong with you. You are not broken. You are not bad. There is not something fundamentally messed up about you. You are not hopeless. You are not wrong. You are a person doing the best that you have, best that you can with what you have right now. And the solution to getting you to a place where you can be less harmful is always going to be deeper understanding of what's going on in you, what you need, what you went through, how what you're doing right now is meeting needs in the only way you know how to meet them, how you're not being supported, where you're coping. Like, there's never a time when we have to sit back and say, this is wrong and bad about you. This is just a bad part of yourself that you're going to have to try to fix for the rest of your life. That is never the reality. It's always going to be either where were you taught that what you naturally fundamentally are is wrong and bad, and it just isn't. It's just a totally fine characteristic that for some reason your caregivers and the society you live in has decided it's wrong and bad for maintaining the structures, for just because we misunderstand things or whatever. And where are these parts of yourself that are actually causing harm in need of support and love and guidance? So that's always going to be the reality. You are not the exception, and there is no part of you that is the exception, including the parts of yourself that, right, like can't fit into the structure of society, that can't work the way that you're supposed to work to make enough money, that can't do the things you're supposed to do to be a success in our culture, that don't align with how relationships are supposed to look, that don't align with, including all of that stuff, including all the things that are inhibiting you from having a peaceful experience in this reality that we live in. Those are still not wrong, bad things about you. That's still the consensus reality that isn't working for everyone. It's always going to come down to that. So in the last video, we were talking about how our caregivers are people who are not perfect, and they were not perfect. And much of the time when they hurt us, they weren't doing it on purpose, and they weren't coming from a place of being all-knowing and understanding and just hurting us anyways. They weren't coming from a place of having the capacity to support us and love us and guide us, and they just chose not to. It's that they really just couldn't. They really actually didn't have access to what we have access to now in terms of understanding or resource or technology. And even though we can look back and see how they should have been able to do better and they could have done better, there's going to come a point where we just say, given what they went through and given where they were, they probably couldn't. They just couldn't have done what we did. They couldn't have known what we know now. They couldn't have done better. And this does not mean, okay, very important, this does not mean that if in current reality your caregivers are still harmful towards you, they still misunderstand you, they still shame you, they still guilt you, they still trigger you into feeling like you're not good enough in some way, their behavior is toxic to you in some way, this does not mean you say, well, it wasn't their fault, they couldn't have done better, and therefore I forgive them and I let them back in my life and they can just shit all over me. It never means that. Again, what you're wanting to come to here is that it wasn't your fault, is that it wasn't about you, is that it wasn't a failing on your part, it wasn't a fundamental flaw in your design, it wasn't you doing the wrong thing or being the wrong way, it wasn't you. It wasn't you. And that means that even to this day, if you need to maintain boundaries with your caregivers because they can't be better for you, we can start to, again, have compassion and understanding that they went through shitty things, that they were traumatized, that they didn't have access, that they didn't have resources. And we can start to understand why they are the way that they are. That has nothing to do with us. And still maintain boundaries and still say, you don't get to be in my life, and still say, I forgive you, I understand why you are the way that you are, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to let you put your cigarette on my leg every time I see you, right? Like, I can understand why you harm me. I can understand why at this point you can't, or you're choosing not to evolve, change, be better, be less harmful, but that still doesn't mean I'm going to let you back into my life, okay? Those are two different things. And then the next thing to understand, okay, and again, this, why I say this is all for you to understand that your caregiver's behavior isn't real reality. If at any point they shamed you, guilted you, blamed you, or abandoned you, your caregiver's perspective was not real reality. So when you start to understand, now this next part, that your caregivers were conditioned to believe things that are not in alignment with reality. They had to live up to the expectation of their caregivers. Their caregivers were living up to the expectation of their caregivers. Their caregivers were living up to the expectation of their caregivers. And the expectation of everyone's caregivers was partially formed by the life that the caregiver lived. Now, if you take a step back and understand that the world that your caregivers grew up in is completely different than the world that you're living in now. So all of the things that they had to do and they had to be and what was right and what got them success and what got them rejected and abandoned and what got them accepted and loved had likely changed by the time you came along. And yet, right, so much of their programming came from their caregivers, which was based on a life that had changed quite a bit by the time your caregivers came along. So all of these expectations, and this is what you have to do, and this is what you have to be, and these are the right ways of being, and it was all based on a reality that no longer existed. So part of what your caregivers projected onto you as being right ways to be, wrong ways to be, what you have to do, what you can't do, had nothing to do with the world you were going to step into, and everything to do with the world that they lived in and the experiences they had. So they were projecting their fears, their failures, their misunderstandings, and how they perceived why they were in pain and why life didn't work out for them onto you, what they wish they had done different, what they thought if they had done different it would have gone different. And they were putting that all on you. You can't be this way, you can't do that, you have to do this, you have to do that, this is how to succeed. And all of that was based on false perceptions of the world you were about to step into. And that's something we really need to take into consideration. The religious dogma, this is how you have to be educated, this is the kind of job you have to have, these are the kinds of relationships you have to have. So much of what they gave to you was irrelevant to the world you were stepping into. So there's this conflict of you now feeling like I have to do and be what my caregivers want me to be in order to be safe and good. But the reality of actually following through with that, not making you safe and good in real reality. Because in real reality, the world has shifted. So now you have this crossing of the wires of, do I do what's pertinent in real society, or do I do what my caregivers wanted me to do? And I'm going to feel bad either way, because if I do what my caregivers wanted me to do to a degree, I'm not in alignment with real reality, and I'm probably not in alignment with what's actually going to work for me. And if I don't do what my caregivers want me to do, I'm going to feel in my nervous system like I'm dying, because that's going to read to me as existential threat. You're not living up to your parents' expectation. You're going to die. So there's that level of it. And we really need to take that into consideration. And then the last thing we need to take into consideration is, again, so much of the good, bad, right, wrong, this is a good emotion, this is a bad emotion, you shouldn't feel how you feel, you shouldn't be how you are, was coming from your parents' misunderstanding. It was coming from what they wanted and what they needed at the time. It was coming from their own shame, their own guilt, their own inability to own their emotions, and they were projecting all of that onto you. So another huge thing that I want you to take into consideration right now is anytime your caregivers could not meet your needs, they could not comfort you in your emotions, they couldn't validate you in what you were thinking and feeling, they couldn't intellectually support you, they couldn't physically support you, it was never your fault. It was never your fault. You were the child, and it was their job to care for you. If you were having a tantrum, if you were having an emotional experience, if you were scared, if you were expressing some violent or obnoxious or loud or whatever behavior, it was always their job to understand you, to help support you in learning what you needed to learn, to be on your side, and to help you process your emotions, to help you process your feelings, to help you process your thoughts, to help you get your needs met It was always their job. So any part of yourself that you feel like this is a wrong and a bad part of me, I was too loud, I had a wrong feeling, I'm ashamed of how I felt, I'm ashamed of what I perceived, I'm ashamed of how I reacted or how I responded. In your childhood, it was never on you. It was always on your caregivers to understand you and to help you. And again, sometimes they just couldn't, sometimes they weren't able, and we need to sometimes go through the process of being mad at them and upset with them so that we're no longer turning that anger in on ourselves. I shouldn't have been that way. I feel ashamed that I felt this way about my caregivers. I feel ashamed that I felt this way about my life experience, the way that they were telling me that I shouldn't. I feel ashamed of these parts of myself that my caregivers rejected. We have to sometimes turn it in and say, no, you were wrong, you were bad, I hate you. And then we eventually come back to, it was always their job to meet your needs. And if they didn't, it was on them. They may have been sick, they may have been struggling, they may have been lacking resources, whatever it was. And you can come to a place where eventually you see it doesn't hurt anymore because you see that it wasn't about you. Because you see that their behavior towards you and the way that they treated you badly, or they shamed you, or they guilted you, or they told you you shouldn't feel that way, or you had negative feelings towards them for the ways that they were behaving, and you made that a bad thing about you. When you had negative feelings towards your caregivers and you became ashamed and disgusted at yourself, that's again never your fault. It's never your fault, never your fault, never something wrong with you. It was their lack of understanding. It was their lack of perception. It was their projection of what they wanted or needed, what they had been conditioned to believe was true and real, their beliefs about reality that was clouding their perception and their capacity to help you. It was just their lack of resource. All of these things, it wasn't about you. So if they ever shamed you, if they ever blamed you, it was never your fault. If they ever didn't show up for your experience, it was never your fault. If they couldn't care for you, it was never your fault. If you felt negative feelings towards your caregivers during your childhood at any point, you had a good reason to feel that way. It wasn't about you. They didn't shame, abandon, and reject you because there's actually something wrong with you, ever. It was always their misunderstanding, their projection, whatever was going on with them. It was always a consensus reality that they were projecting onto you that isn't in alignment with true and real reality. So where can you start to understand that your caregivers were projecting, that your caregivers were just incapable, that your caregivers were doing the best they could with what they had and it wasn't very good? Where can you start to see that they didn't show up for you and that was on them? It was always, always, always on them. It was never because of you not being good enough, you not being worthy, you not doing what you should have done. You were always deserving and worthy of having your needs met and being supported for your entire childhood. And any story that is different than that is untrue. You were always worthy of love and care and resource. And any amount you didn't get that, it was not your fault. It was your caregiver's lack of capacity, and that's what it was. So we're going to continue talking about this in the next couple of videos, but what if it wasn't about you? What if there's absolutely no wrong, bad part of you because it wasn't about you? It was their incapacity. So all of these parts of yourself that you do not like, where was it not that this part is bad, but your caregiver is not being capable? Where were you not getting your needs met because your caregivers weren't capable? It was never your fault, so what was actually happening? There's no bad part of you, so what was actually happening? Start to look at that, and we'll see you in the next video.